The planet, Xerxes 12, floated on the fringes of explored space. It was the kind of place where geological survey teams went when there were no other options left. I was part of one such team, sent to probe the planet's potential for rare minerals. We had been there for weeks, scraping the surface, analyzing samples, and mapping the terrain. It was during one of these mundane tasks that I discovered it, a rift in the bedrock. I had never seen anything like it before. It wasn't just a crack or a fault line, it was a jagged tear in the earth, dark and gloomy. I was drawn to it, compelled by professional curiosity and an inexplicable dread. The rift was about 10 meters wide and plunged into darkness. I set up my portable lights around the perimeter, their white beams cutting into the gloom. The rock around the rift was strange, almost as if it had been melted and then solidified again. I decided to take a closer look. Securing my harness, I anchored it to a sturdy outcrop and began my descent. The walls of the rift were rough, covered in organic patterns that made my skin crawl. About 20 meters down, I found a ledge and decided to take a sample. As I hammered my pick into the rock, the ground beneath me shifted. The ledge crumbled, and I was suddenly falling. I scrambled to grab hold of anything, but my fingers only met slick, unyielding stone. I landed hard on another ledge, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Dazed, I tried to assess my situation. My flashlight had gone out, and I was enveloped in total darkness. I fumbled for my backup light. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam revealed a tunnel leading deeper into the planet. Despite the pain in my side, I felt an irrational urge to continue. I told myself it was the scientist in me, but deep down I knew it was something more. Something I couldn't quite understand. I had been walking for a while when I finally reached an open chamber. In the center stood a monolith, an enormous slab of obsidian-like rock. I approached it cautiously. As I reached out to touch it, the ground beneath me shook violently. The patterns on the rock began to glow, and a green light filled the chamber. I tried to back away, but it was too late. The light engulfed me, and I felt myself being pulled towards the monolith, my body stretched and twisted by forces beyond comprehension. I blacked out. When I awoke, I was lying on cold, hard ground. It was a struggle to sit up. My body felt stiff and sore. The chamber was gone, replaced by an impossible scene. The sky above was a roiling mass of dark clouds, occasionally lit by flashes of eerie green lightning. The ground was a nightmarish version of the terrain I had been surveying, with jagged rocks and glowing plants. In the distance, I could see monstrous silhouettes moving, their forms indistinct but terrifying. I had somehow been transported to a nightmarish version of the planet, a place where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The first priority was survival. I checked my gear. My flashlight was still working and I had my basic tools, but my communicator was dead. I was alone in this hellish landscape with no way to call for help. I kept moving, each step a struggle against the unknown. My flashlight's beam cut through the murky gloom, revealing more of the same eerie terrain. I tried to recall the events that led me here, piecing together fragmented memories of the rift and the monolith. My thoughts were interrupted by a distant, animalistic growl that made me tremble. I froze, scanning my surroundings for any sign of movement. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving across the ground. I ducked behind a large rock. The sounds became more intense and clear. Peering cautiously around the edge of the rock, I saw four-legged predators, their muscular bodies covered in sinew and exposed muscle. Their heads were twisted, resembling distorted canine skulls. They moved, sniffing the air, their keen sense of smell undoubtedly picking up my scent. They were hunting me. I held my breath, trying to remain as still as possible. The predators fanned out, their movements coordinated, clearly a pack. One of them paused, lifting its head to sniff the air again. It turned in my direction, its eyes locking onto my hiding spot. I knew I had to move. I darted from behind the rock, sprinting across the uneven terrain. The pack let out a chorus of bone-chilling howls and gave chase. My legs burned with exertion, and the heavy air made it difficult to breathe, but fear propelled me forward. I could hear the predators gaining on me, their powerful limbs propelling them over the rough ground. Desperation drove me to seek any kind of shelter. Up ahead, I spotted an opening in the ground, a narrow cave entrance, barely visible among the rocks. I veered towards it, hoping it would provide some refuge. As I reached the entrance, I threw myself inside, the rough edges of the rock scraping my skin. The cave was dark and cramped, but it provided a temporary barrier between me and the predators. I crawled deeper into the darkness, my flashlight dimming as its battery struggled to maintain power. The howls of the pack echoed outside, growing more frustrated as they realized I had slipped out of their reach. I listened intently, hoping the predators would lose interest and move on. The howling eventually died down, leaving behind a disturbing quiet. I knew this cave was only a temporary sanctuary. The predators would be back, and I needed to find a way out of this nightmare world. I pushed myself deeper into the cave, hoping to find an exit or at least a place to regroup and plan my next move. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing in some places and widening in others. My flashlight's beam illuminated strange markings on the walls, similar to the ones I had seen in the rift. I reached out to touch one of the markings, feeling a strange warmth beneath my fingers. As I moved further into the cave, the markings became more frequent. The tunnel opened into a larger space, and I stopped in my tracks. In the center stood another monolith, similar to the one I'd encountered before. It was smaller, but the same patterns covered its surface. Approaching cautiously, I felt a pull, a compulsion to touch the monolith. I hesitated, remembering the last time I had interacted with one of these structures. But curiosity overrode my caution. I reached out, placing my hand on the smooth, cold surface. A sharp pain shot through my hand and I pulled it back, staring in horror as the flesh seemed to warp and twist. I stumbled backward, the pain spreading up my arm. The chamber began to spin, the walls closing in on me. I fell to my knees, clutching my arm as the pain intensified. The monolith's light grew blinding and I felt my consciousness slipping away. As the darkness closed in, I heard a distant voice. A voice that seemed to come from the depths of the nightmare world itself. Welcome to your new reality. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the ground outside the cave. The sky was still a tumultuous sea of dark clouds and green lightning. I struggled to sit up, my arm still throbbing with pain. The markings from the monolith had etched themselves into my skin, glowing faintly. I was changing, becoming part of this world. The realization hit me with a cold, brutal clarity. There was no easy way out. I was trapped in this hellish landscape, fighting not just for my survival, but for my sanity. I continued moving through the landscape. After some time, I caught sight of a figure in the distance. My first thought was that it might be another one of the nightmare creatures. But as I got closer, I saw that it was a human, a fellow survivor. His clothes were tattered and stained with dirt and blood. He looked thin and scared, his eyes wide with fear and insanity. He had the same markings on his skin that I did, glowing faintly in the darkness. His hair was matted and his hands twitched constantly as if he were perpetually on edge. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and strained. The man spun around, eyes wild. For a moment he looked like he might run, but then recognition seemed to dawn on him. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. You're like me," he said, his voice scratchy. "Marked by the monolith. You came through the rift." I nodded, keeping my distance but making it clear I meant no harm. "Yeah, I did. Name's Sam. Who are you?" "Call me Kane," he replied, his eyes darting around as if expecting an attack at any moment. "Do you know what this place is?" I asked, desperate for any information. Kane let out a harsh, humorless laugh. This is hell, or as close to it as you can get. It's a twisted mirror of our world, a place where nightmares come to life. The rift pulls you in, and once you're here, it doesn't let go. He looked me over, his expression shifting from fear to a twisted kind of hope. You survived this long, so you must have some brains. Listen carefully, because knowing how to survive is the only thing that'll keep you alive here. Kane began to share what he knew. He spoke in a rapid, disjointed manner, his thoughts jumping from one topic to another. But I managed to piece together the crucial information. He told me about the different creatures that roamed this world, the massive, slug-like beings that exuded corrosive slime, the pack-hunting predators with flayed skin and canine skulls, the ethereal shadow figures that could phase through solid objects, and the vulture-like creatures that circled above, sensing death from miles away. Food is scarce, Kane explained, his eyes distant. You have to scavenge what you can. Some of the plants are edible, but most are poisonous. You'll learn to tell the difference by the way they look and smell. Water's trickier. There are pools, but they're often contaminated. If you find any, filter it through cloth. Boil it if you can. He showed me a small pouch filled with dried, shriveled berries and a few strips of what looked like dried meat. This is what I've managed to gather. It's not much, but it keeps you going. As he spoke, I noticed his hands shaking more violently. He caught my gaze and gave a bitter smile. The madness gets to you after a while. This place, it changes you. The markings are just the beginning. You start to see things, hear things that aren't there. Sometimes you can't tell what's real and what's not. Have you found any way out? Kane shook his head. No way out that I've found. The rift brought us here, but it doesn't let us go. I've searched for another rift, something that might take me back, but all I've found are more horrors. The monoliths, they're connected to this place somehow. They change you, but they might also be the key to escaping. I just haven't figured out how. He looked at me, his eyes suddenly intense. Don't trust the shadows. They're more than just creatures. They're part of this world, and they can sense your fear. Stay in the light as much as you can and keep moving. Staying in one place too long makes you an easy target. We sat in silence for a while. Kane's information was invaluable, but his madness was a stark reminder of what this place could do to a person. Kane and I decided that sticking together would increase our chances of survival. His knowledge of this world, combined with my fresh perspective, made us a formidable team, at least on paper. The first priority was to find a safe place to rest and plan our next move. We found a spot nestled between two large rock formations, which provided natural barriers on two sides. The space was small, but defensible. Kane had scouted this area before and suggested it as a temporary shelter. We began to fortify it using materials we scavenged from the surrounding terrain. We collected branches from the gnarled trees that dotted the landscape. Their wood was tough and splintered easily, making it perfect for building spears and setting up traps. Kane showed me how to sharpen the branches into deadly points and how to arrange them around our shelter to form a crude but effective defensive perimeter. While we worked, Kane shared more about his past. He had been a miner on a colony world, much like Xerxes 12 when he discovered a similar rift. The pull of curiosity had been his downfall, much like mine. He spoke about his family, his wife and daughter, whom he hoped to see again one day, even though the hope seemed to wane in his eyes as he spoke. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. We huddled around a fire. The fire was small to avoid attracting unwanted attention, but it provided just enough warmth to keep the chill at bay. How long have you been here? I asked, breaking the silence that had settled over us. Kane stared into the flames, his face showing fatigue and sorrow. Months? Years? Time doesn't flow right here. It's hard to keep track. Some days blend into nights without any real distinction. All I know is that it's been long enough to lose hope of rescue. We lapsed back into silence. The psychological toll of this place was immense. It wasn't just the physical dangers that wore you down. It was the constant sense of isolation, the never-ending fear, and the creeping madness. To distract ourselves, we set about creating more traps. Kane showed me how to weave vines into snares and how to use the environment to our advantage. We set up a series of tripwires connected to sharp stakes that would spring up and impale anything that stumbled into them. It was gruesome but necessary. During the process, Kane revealed more about the creatures that hunted us. The pack-hunting predators were the most immediate threat. They had an almost supernatural sense of smell for blood and could track a wounded prey for miles. Their pack mentality made them incredibly dangerous, and their flayed-open skin exposed sinew and muscle, making them look like something out of a nightmare. "We need to stay vigilant," Kane said as we finished setting the last trap. "They hunt in packs, and they're smart. They'll test our defenses, looking for any weakness. We can't let our guard down." Night had fully settled in, and the landscape was bathed in an eerie dim light from the glowing patterns on the rocks and plants. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant howl of a predator or the rustling of unseen creatures in the dark. We took turns keeping watch, one of us always awake while the other tried to get some rest. Sleep was fleeting and filled with nightmares. I dreamt of the rift, of being pulled into its depths again and again, unable to escape its grasp. During one of our shifts, Kane opened up about the changes he had undergone. The markings on his skin, much like mine, had started to appear after he touched the monolith. At first, they were just strange patterns, but over time they began to glow. He feared what these changes meant, what he might become. "Do you think we're becoming part of this world?" Kane nodded slowly. "I don't know what's happening to us, but I can feel it. This place, it's alive in ways we can't understand. The monoliths, the markings, they're all connected. We need to find out more about them if we're ever going to find a way out." Our conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise. We both froze, straining to listen. Something heavy moved through the underbrush, accompanied by the snapping of branches. "The pack!" Kane whispered, his face pale. "They found us!" We moved quickly and silently, taking up defensive positions behind the rocks. I gripped my spear tightly. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the shadows moving outside our perimeter. The predators approached cautiously, their keen sense of smell undoubtedly picking up our scent. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the dim light. One of them stepped into a tripwire, and the trap sprang to life, impaling the creature on a series of sharp stakes. It let out a pained howl, alerting the rest of the pack. Chaos erupted as the predators launched their attack. They were nimble and menacing, their every step radiating a dangerous energy. Kane and I fought using our spears and the traps to keep them at bay. One of the predators jumped at me, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I drove my spear into its exposed chest, feeling the weapon sink into muscle and bone. The creature let out a final gasp before collapsing at my feet. I didn't have time to catch my breath before another one was on me, but Kane intervened, skewering it with his own spear. The battle was brutal and desperate, but our traps and teamwork held. Finally, the surviving predators retreated into the darkness. We stood there, panting and covered in sweat and blood, but victorious. The bodies of the predators lay scattered around our camp, their exposed muscles twitching in death. Kane approached one of the carcasses, wiping sweat and blood from his face. "We can't waste this," he said, crouching down. "Their meat is edible if you cook it well enough. It's not pleasant, but it'll keep us alive." I watched as Kane expertly skinned one of the creatures. He worked quickly, using a jagged piece of metal to cut the meat into strips. "Grab some wood for the fire," he instructed, not looking up from his work. I gathered what little dry wood I could find, feeding it into the embers of our dying fire. Soon the flames roared back to life, casting shadows against the rocks. Kane skewered the strips of meat on sticks and placed them over the fire. The smell was acrid and foul, but hunger gnawed at my stomach, overriding my revulsion. As the meat cooked, we sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Kane's face was illuminated by the flames, his eyes reflecting the dancing light. Despite the grimness of our situation, there was a momentary sense of camaraderie, a shared struggle for survival. "Where did you learn to do that?" I asked, nodding towards the roasting meat. Kane shrugged. "I've been here a long time. You learn what you need to survive. These things," he gestured to the carcasses, "they're tough, but their meat is protein. You get used to the taste after a while." I took a piece of the cooked meat, hesitating for a moment before biting into it. The texture was tough and chewy, the taste bitter, but it was sustenance. Kane watched me with a grim smile. "Better than starving, right?" I nodded, chewing slowly. When we finished, we doused the fire, not wanting to attract any more attention. Exhaustion came over me and I lay down on the cold ground, using my pack as a pillow. Kane sat beside me, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We should get some rest. We'll need our strength for tomorrow." Sleep was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of home and the nightmarish landscape that surrounded us. I awoke several times, each time finding Kane awake and vigilant. His dedication to our survival was both reassuring and unsettling. He was a man on the edge, pushed to his limits by this unforgiving world. Morning, or what passed for morning in this place, came with a dull light. The sky remained a churning mass of dark clouds and green lightning. Kane was already up, packing what little gear we had. "We need to move," he said. "We can't stay in one place for too long. It's not safe." We gathered our supplies and set off, navigating the landscape with caution and urgency. The terrain was unforgiving, every step a challenge as we moved through the twisted world. After hours of walking, we stumbled upon what looked like the remains of a settlement. The structures were in ruins, half buried in the earth and covered in the same glowing symbols that marked the walls of the ancient temple we had explored earlier. Kane and I exchanged a wary glance before cautiously approaching the settlement. The buildings were constructed from a dark stone, their walls crumbling and overgrown with vegetation that thrived in this nightmare world. We entered what appeared to be the remains of a larger building, perhaps a communal hall or a meeting place. Kane began sifting through the rubble, his eyes scanning for anything of use. I joined him, pushing aside broken pieces of stone and wood. It was then that I found it, a journal, its leather cover worn and stained, but remarkably intact. I picked it up, feeling a surge of anticipation. "Kane, look at this," I said, holding up the journal. He hurried over, his eyes widening as he saw what I had found. We moved to a corner of the room where the light was better and began to carefully open the journal. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, and the language was one we could understand. The journal belonged to a previous survivor, someone who had been trapped in this world long before us. The entries detailed their daily struggles, encounters with the creatures, and their attempts to find a way back to the real world. We read through the entries, learning about the horrors the previous survivor had faced. They described encounters with the massive slug-like beings, the pack-hunting predators, the ethereal shadow figures, and the vulture-like creatures. The descriptions were vivid and harrowing, but amidst the tales of terror, there were also cryptic hints about the monoliths. The survivor had believed that the monoliths were the key to escaping, but they had never managed to fully decipher their secrets. However, they had discovered references to a mysterious place, a location where a massive monolith stood, a monolith that dwarfed all others. According to the journal, this place was guarded by a series of tests or trials. Passing these tests could potentially open a portal back to the real world, but the consequences of failure were dire. Those who failed the trials were said to be transformed into the ethereal shadow figures that roamed the planet, condemned to wander the nightmare world for eternity. Kane and I exchanged a grim look as we finished reading the journal. The hope of escape was tantalizing, but the risk was immense. We now had a goal, a direction to head towards. We spent the rest of the day scouring the ruins for any additional supplies or clues. We found a few more useful items, some preserved food, a canteen, and a crude map that seemed to outline the way to the massive monolith mentioned in the journal. As night began to fall, we made our way to a more secure building within the settlement, setting up a small camp. The ruins offered some protection from the elements and potential threats. We rested as best we could, our sleep restless and filled with disjointed dreams of home and the horrors of this nightmarish world. When dawn broke, we packed our supplies and prepared to move out. The map from the journal was our guide, leading us toward the mysterious location where the massive monolith awaited. Hours passed as we trekked through the increasingly hostile landscape. Kane's knowledge of the terrain and my fresh determination kept us focused and alert. As we reached the outskirts of a dense forest, we encountered figures in the distance drifting just above the ground. They were ethereal, shadowy beings, their forms barely more than wisps of darkness. They moved slowly, aimlessly, as if searching for something lost. I felt a chill run down my spine as we observed them. "What are they?" I whispered to Kane. "Failed souls," he replied. "Those who tried to escape and failed. They're trapped here, condemned to wander this world forever." We watched the ghostly figures for a moment longer, their presence a stark reminder of the risks we faced. They didn't seem aggressive, merely lost and forlorn. Their eyes seemed to gaze into the void, seeing nothing and everything at once. "Let's keep moving," Kane urged. "We don't want to attract their attention." We continued our journey, skirting the edge of the forest to avoid the ghostly figures. The terrain began to change, the ground leveling out into a vast open plain. The sky loomed overhead, casting an unnatural light that made everything seem washed out and lifeless. In the distance, a faint glow caught our attention. It was different from the plants and the occasional bursts of green lightning. The light was constant. "There," Kane said, pointing toward the glow. "That must be it. The monolith." We quickened our pace, our anticipation growing with each step. The glow grew brighter as we approached, illuminating the landscape with a green light. As we drew closer, the monolith came into view. It was immense, towering over the landscape like a dark sentinel. The ground around the monolith was bare, with no plants growing. The empty space felt strangely cold. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring in awe at the massive obelisk. "This is it," Kane said. "The monolith of all monoliths, the key to our escape." I felt a mixture of fear and hope as I stared at the towering structure. The journal's warnings about the trials and the consequences of failure echoed in my mind. We had come so far, and the answers we sought were finally within reach. Kane and I exchanged a final look, and without a word we placed our hands on the cold, smooth surface of the monolith. Instantly, the world around us dissolved into a blinding white light, and I felt myself being pulled into another realm. When the light faded, I found myself alone in a vast, empty expanse. A voice, ancient and echoing, filled the void around me. "Welcome to the trial of memory sacrifice," the voice intoned. "To proceed, you must sacrifice your most precious memory." I was taken aback by the sheer scale of what was being asked of me. My most precious memory? Images flashed before my eyes. My family, my childhood, my first love. But which one was the most precious? The voice seemed to sense my hesitation. "Choose wisely," it warned. "The memory you sacrifice will be lost forever." I closed my eyes and thought about the moments that defined me. One memory stood out above all others. A sunny afternoon in the park, my mother holding my hand as we fed the ducks. I was a child then, and that moment had always been a source of comfort and joy. It was a memory that had seen me through the darkest times. With a heavy heart, I whispered, "I choose to sacrifice the memory of my mother." The moment I spoke, a searing pain shot through my head. I felt the memory being ripped away, leaving a gaping void. When the pain subsided, the voice spoke again, softer this time. "You have passed the first trial. Now prepare for the trial of ultimate sacrifice." The white light engulfed me once more, and I found myself in a different place. A shadowy figure materialized before me, its form shifting and indistinct. "To pass this trial," the figure said, "you must sacrifice yourself so that the other may go free." The words struck me with the weight of 1,000 fears. I thought about Cain, the bond we had formed, and the horrors we had endured together. But as much as I cared for him, the instinct for self-preservation kicked in. Could I really sacrifice myself for him? Thoughts of my own survival, of returning home, of reclaiming my life flashed through my mind. The possibility of seeing familiar faces, feeling the warmth of the sun, and escaping this hellish place was almost too much to give up. I glanced around the room, hoping for some sign, some loophole that could spare me from this impossible choice. I wrestled with the selfish desire to live, to not let my story end here. But then I thought of Cain, his haunted eyes, the sacrifices he had already made, and the way he had guided me through this nightmare. I remembered his stories of a past he might never see again, his wife and daughter, his desperate hope of finding a way out. The realization of what he meant to me, the connection we had forged in this world, finally broke through my fear. "I'll do it," I said. "I'll sacrifice myself." The room began to dissolve into the familiar, blinding light. As I was consumed by the light, I heard Cain's voice in my mind, filled with desperation. When the light faded, I was back in front of the massive obelisk. Cain appeared beside me, looking equally disoriented. The voice of the monolith filled the clearing. "You have both passed the trials. Because each of you chose to sacrifice yourselves for the other, you have proven your worth. Had either of you refused, you both would have been condemned to roam this land as ghosts for eternity. Now, you may return to your worlds." We stared at the monolith in disbelief, then at each other. The realization washed over us. We had both been willing to sacrifice ourselves for the other. It had been a test of our willingness to give up everything for someone else. 2 portals opened before us, shimmering with ethereal light. Relief and exhaustion mingled in my chest as I looked at Cain. "We did it," I said, a smile breaking through the weariness. "We can go home. You can see your wife and daughter again, Cain." Cain looked at me, confusion lining his features. "What are you talking about? I don't have a wife and daughter." His words struck me. Cain had lost his most precious memory in the first trial, which meant I must have too. The full weight of it hit me. I had sacrificed something incredibly important, something I would never be able to remember. I would never know what memory had been taken from me, only that it had once been my most cherished. "I guess we both lost something important," I said quietly, the weight of the loss settling over me. "But I'm glad you get to go home, Cain. You deserve it." Cain still looked confused, but he nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sam, for everything." We stood there for a moment, 2 survivors on the brink of escape, bound by shared suffering and the sacrifices we had made. Then, with a final nod, we each stepped through our respective portals, the light swallowing us whole. I found myself back on Xerxes 12, the planet where it all began. The familiar landscape stretched out before me, a stark contrast to the nightmarish world I had just escaped. I took a deep breath, the cold, thin air filling my lungs, and I knew I was home. Glancing down at my arms, I saw that the symbols and markings etched into my skin during my ordeal were gone, leaving no trace of the horrors I had faced. The rift that had pulled me into the nightmare world was gone, closed forever. My equipment lay scattered where I'd left it, undisturbed. I gathered my tools and slowly made my way back to the base camp, each step feeling surreal, as if I were walking in a dream. When I arrived at the base camp, I found it deserted. My colleagues had long since abandoned the search, believing me lost to the rift forever. I activated the emergency beacon and settled in to wait, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had endured and what I had lost. It wasn't long before a rescue team arrived, their expressions a mix of shock and relief. They bombarded me with questions, but I could only provide vague answers. How could I explain the horrors I had faced, the trials I had endured, and the precious memory I had sacrificed without even knowing what it was? Back at the colony, life resumed a semblance of normalcy. I returned to my work as a geologist, but something fundamental had changed. I moved through my days with a sense of detachment, haunted by the knowledge of what lay beyond the rift. My colleagues noticed the change. The way my eyes seemed to look through them. The way I hesitated before answering questions about my time in the rift. I often found myself wandering the barren landscape of Xerxes 12, drawn to the places where the rift had once been. I searched for any signs of the nightmare world, any remnants of the horrors I had faced, but there was nothing, just the cold, empty planet. In the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I wondered about Cain. Had he made it back to his world safely? Did he ever remember what he had lost? The questions gnawed at me, but I knew I would never have answers. Our paths had crossed in the most unimaginable way, and we had parted with our fates forever altered. Years passed, and the memories of the nightmare world faded, but the void remained. I learned to live with it, to accept the unknown. Life on Xerxes 12 continued, with new challenges and discoveries, but the experience had changed me in ways that were invisible to others yet profound to me. I had escaped the nightmare world, but a part of me would always remain there, bound by the trials and the sacrifices we had made. The knowledge of what lay beyond the rift, the understanding of the true cost of survival stayed with me, shaping the rest of my days. And as I looked up at the alien sky, I felt a bittersweet sense of freedom. Knowing that while I had returned to my world, the journey had left an indelible mark on my soul. A reminder of the price of escape and the fragility of memory.